There are objects that hold more than dust and forgotten years. There are objects that contain entire worlds, complete lives, hearts that beat strong beneath skies that no longer exist. Today I want to tell you my story. The story of a man who traded endless wheat fields for asphalt streets, the silence of wide-open plains for the constant noise of engines, the freedom of the horizon for the four walls of an apartment where barely an echo remains of who I once was. For decades I kept the memories of my youth locked in a rusted trunk. I hid it in the darkest corner, the way you hide wounds that hurt too much to look at directly. But a few days ago, while organizing my room, my hands brushed against that ancient wood and something inside me broke. Or perhaps it mended. Because when I opened that lid and breathed in the smell of old leather and dry earth, I understood that you never truly leave the places that formed you. You carry them engraved in your soul, beating with every breath, whispering in every silence. This is the story of a reunion, of a man who discovered that the footprints we leave on the land are less deep than the footprints the land leaves on us. It's the story of how progress tore us from our roots, but couldn't tear the roots from our hearts. It's the story of all those who had to choose between staying and starving, or leaving and dying of longing. Join me on this journey into the past, toward the wheat fields my grandfather cultivated with his own hands, toward the plains that watched generations of my family grow, toward the love that bloomed beneath open skies. And perhaps at the end of this road, you too will remember that we all carry within us the echo of a land that waits for us, patient and eternal, to receive us when our time comes to return. My name is Samuel Hayes, and I'm 74 years old. I live in a small apartment on the outskirts of Chicago, surrounded by the constant noise of a city that never sleeps. This morning I woke before dawn, as I've done my entire life. The body doesn't forget the rhythms it learned in youth, even though 50 years have passed since I stopped working the wheat fields. The room was dim. Through the window barely entered the grayish light of urban dawn. I got up slowly, feeling each of my years in joints that protest with every movement. I made coffee in the tiny kitchen, that ritual that connects me to something familiar amid so much strangeness. While I drank the bitter coffee, my gaze fell on the corner where I accumulate boxes and unused objects. And there, almost hidden behind everything, was the trunk. That damned trunk I hadn't opened in decades. The trunk that contained everything I was before becoming this, a lonely old man in a city that doesn't feel like his own. Something pushed me closer. Perhaps it was the loneliness of this particular morning, or the dream I had last night where I walked again between rows of wheat under the relentless sun. I moved the boxes that covered it, and there it was. Dark wood, rusted hardware, the lid scratched by time and moves. I ran my hand over the rough surface. My fingers trembled. I knew that opening that trunk was opening a wound that never finished healing. But I also knew I could no longer keep running. I lifted the lid carefully, and a smell hit me with the force of a lived memory. Earth, leather, honest sweat, oil spilled on old wood. Inside was my previous life. A work shirt faded by 1,000 washings and 1,000 suns. My straw hat, crushed but recognizable. A red bandana that Martha had given me on our wedding day. Black and white photographs where I smile with a joy I haven't felt since. And at the bottom, carefully rolled up, my pruning shears. The shears my father gave me when I turned 18. The same ones I used to tend thousands of wheat stalks during 20 years of work. I took them from the trunk and held them in my trembling hands. The metal was cold and rusted. The blades no longer had the edge that once made them sing when cutting the stalks. But touching them, I felt an electric current run through my body. It was as if those shears held memory of every field we tended together, of every sunset on the plains, of every drop of honest sweat that fell on the land I loved. I closed my eyes and the room disappeared. I was no longer in Chicago. I was back in the Kansas plains, 19 years old, learning the trade my family had practiced for generations. I started working on Mr. Thomas Patterson's wheat farm when I was 19. My father had worked there his whole life, my grandfather before him. We were part of the land as much as the wheat itself. Mr. Patterson was a hard but fair man, the kind who worked alongside his employees under the same relentless sun. The farm was on the rolling plains, where the land was tough but generous. We produced some of the finest wheat in the county. Every bushel carried the sweat of dozens of families who had dedicated their lives to that soil. The first years were learning years. My father taught me to read the fields like you read a book, to recognize when they needed water, when the soil was tired, when the harvest was ready. I learned that farming wasn't just labor, it was understanding, patience, respect for something bigger than yourself. I fell in love with that work. I fell in love with waking before dawn and walking toward the fields while dew still wet the earth. I fell in love with the smell of ripe wheat under the sun, the sound of the scythe cutting through stalks, the honest tiredness at day's end that made me sleep deeply without needing anything else. It was during the harvest of my second year when I met Martha. She came from a nearby town with other women to help with the work. I saw her bent over gathering wheat, with her colorful scarf protecting her hair from the sun, and I knew she was the woman I wanted to spend my life with. The courtship was slow and respectful, as things were done then. Brief conversations during breaks, glances that said more than words, permission asked from her father to visit on Sundays. We married a year later in the small church in town, with Mr. Patterson's blessing and the joy of our families. Martha moved into the small house the farm provided us. It was modest but sufficient. 2 rooms with wooden floors and a tin roof. She filled it with life. She planted flowers in old cans, hung curtains she sewed with her own hands, cooked on a wood stove meals that made every day worthwhile. For 10 years we lived in that simple happiness. Our 2 children were born. Jacob first, then Rose. We raised them among the fields, teaching them to love the land as we loved it. Jacob followed me to the fields from the moment he could walk, watching every movement, learning the trade he would someday inherit. Those were years of hard but satisfying work. We earned little, barely enough to live with dignity. But we were happy in a way I haven't experienced since. There was purpose in every day, community in every gesture, connection to something greater than ourselves. I especially remember the summer nights. After dinner, Martha and I would go sit in front of the house. We'd watch the stars in silence while the wind brought the scent of ripening wheat. We didn't need words. Our happiness was so complete that silence contained it perfectly. But the world was changing, and that change would soon reach us like a storm that erases everything in its path. It came first as rumors. Workers who went to town talked about enormous machines that could do the work of 50 men, of tractors that replaced horses, of automated irrigation systems that didn't need the constant hand of the worker. At first we paid them no mind. Change had always been slow in our region. But progress, when it arrives like an avalanche. In a matter of 2 years, everything changed. Mr. Patterson started having problems. Wheat produced in mass by large corporations with modern technology was flooding the market. Traditional production costs couldn't compete. Small and medium farms were going under one after another. Mr. Patterson tried to modernize. He took out loans to buy machinery. But the debt grew faster than the profits. And then came the day we feared. He gathered all of us under the main barn. His face was gray, suddenly aged. "Boys," he said with a broken voice, "the farm is bankrupt. I have to sell the land to pay the debts. I'm sorry with all my soul. You've been more than workers. You've been family. But there's nothing more I can do." The silence that followed was terrible. Some men cried openly. Others stared at the ground, unable to process the reality. I felt like my heart had been ripped from my chest. This land was my identity. Without it, who was I? During the following weeks, I tried to find work on other farms. But the situation was the same everywhere. Modernization was eliminating traditional jobs. The few available positions were temporary and poorly paid. One night, after another day of fruitless searching, I sat with Martha. She'd been crying, I knew from her red eyes. "Samuel," she said with a trembling voice, "we have to think about the children. There's no future for them here anymore." Her words destroyed me because I knew she was right. I made the most painful decision of my life. We would move to Chicago. There, they said, factories were hiring. It wouldn't be the work I loved, but at least I could provide for my family. The day of departure was the saddest of my life. I packed everything we owned in the trunk my father had given me. I put in my work clothes, my pruning shears, the photographs of our life on the farm. Every object I stored felt like tearing a piece from my soul. We said goodbye to Mr. Patterson, who hugged us with tears in his eyes. "Forgive me," he kept repeating. "Forgive me for not being able to do more." I told him there was nothing to forgive. He too was a victim of forces greater than all of us. We boarded the bus that would take us to Chicago with Jacob and Rose frightened, not fully understanding what was happening. As the vehicle pulled away, I looked back. I saw the plains, the wheat fields that had been my world, the sky I knew like the back of my hand. And I knew, with painful certainty, that a part of me was staying there forever. Chicago received us with its deafening noise and brutal indifference. We arrived in a neighborhood on the outskirts where a distant cousin of Martha's lived. He lent us a room until we found something of our own. It was a tiny space we shared with 2 other families. The air smelled of dampness and despair. The first months were hell. I went out every day looking for work, walking miles through streets I didn't know. At the factories they asked for experience I didn't have. I knew how to tend wheat, not operate complicated machines. I knew how to read the land, not understand industrial blueprints. Finally, I got work as a helper on a construction site. The work was exhausting and dangerous. I carried cement bags that destroyed my back. I climbed shaky scaffolding with heavy tools. I earned barely enough to pay rent for our own room that we got after 6 months. Martha also worked, cleaning houses for well-off families. She left early and returned late, exhausted. The children went to a public school where they mocked their country accent. Little by little, we were all losing something essential of ourselves. I missed the wheat fields with a physical pain that kept me awake. I missed the silence of the plains, the smell of earth after rain, the feeling of freedom that came from working under the open sky. In the city I felt enclosed, crushed, invisible. Martha suffered too. The cheerful woman she'd been on the farm was fading. Her health began to deteriorate. Doctors talked about stress and depression, but I knew it was something deeper. It was the pain of having been torn from the only life she knew. The years passed slowly. The children grew and adapted better than us. Jacob found work as a mechanic. Rose studied to be a secretary. They married, had their own children. For them, life in the country was just a blurry childhood memory. Martha died 8 years ago. Her heart, the doctors said. But I know it was the accumulated weight of so many years of uprooting. On her deathbed, she took my hand and whispered, "Samuel, do you remember when we were happy?" And I could only cry because, yes, I remembered. I remembered every detail of that happiness we lost. After her death, I was left alone. The children come visit when they can, but they have their own lives, their own concerns. I live alone in this small apartment, surrounded by memories that hurt too much to look at directly. That's why I kept the trunk in the darkest corner. Because opening it was opening all the wounds at once. until today. If this story resonates in your heart, if you feel it speaks of you or someone you know, I ask that you leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories that honor the memory of those who worked the land with dignity. Share this video with those who understand that progress has a price we pay with our souls. And leave me in the comments. Did you too have to leave behind a world you loved? Your story matters. After opening the trunk this morning, something changed inside me. I spent hours holding my pruning shears, remembering, feeling. And then I made a decision. I had to go back. I had to see with my own eyes what remained of that world. I told Jacob I was making a trip. He worried, said I was too old to travel alone. But I insisted. I needed to do this. Finally he gave in and gave me money for the bus. The trip lasted 5 hours. As the urban landscape gave way to fields and plains, I felt my heart accelerate. I was going home. Or at least to what remained of it. I arrived at the town near noon. It had changed so much I barely recognized it. Where before there were wooden buildings, now there were modern constructions. The square I remembered as quiet was surrounded by stores with bright signs. But the plains were still there, eternal witnesses to everything that had passed. I asked how to get to what had been Mr. Patterson's farm. An old man gave me directions. It no longer exists as a farm, he told me. They sold the land. Now there are several small parcels and a subdivision where the main access used to be. I got someone to drive me in their pickup truck. The road was paved now. We arrived in 15 minutes. And there it was, at the main entrance where we had once planted the oldest wheat. Now there were modern houses with artificial lawns. I walked beyond the houses, following a path I still recognized. And then I saw what remained of the main house. It was a ruin. The roof had collapsed. The walls were covered in weeds. The barns where we kept the tools were barely some rotted posts. But beyond, miraculously, there were still some rows of wheat. Old, uncared for, but alive. I approached trembling. I touched the stalks with reverence. They were descendants of the plants my grandfather had brought from England a century ago. I knelt on the earth. I took a handful and smelled it deeply. It was the same smell. The same earth I had worked for 20 years. Tears began rolling down my cheeks without me being able to stop them. I took my pruning shears from my backpack. With trembling hands, I began to tend the abandoned wheat. I cut the dead stalks, cleaned the new shoots, did what needed to be done. And with each cut, I felt like I was repairing something inside me. I worked until the sun began to descend. No one bothered me. No one asked what an old man was doing crying among abandoned wheat. I simply let my hands remember the trade, let my heart find peace in the ancient ritual. When I finally stopped, I looked at my work. The wheat looked better, healthier. Perhaps no one else would notice. Perhaps tomorrow it would be abandoned again. But today, for this moment, it had received the care it deserved. And that was enough. I sat under an old tree I remembered from my youth. I watched the plains paint themselves orange with the sunset. It was the same spectacle I had seen thousands of times. And in that moment I understood something fundamental. Progress had destroyed the farm, had scattered the families, had changed the landscape. But it couldn't touch what was essential. The plains were still there. The earth was still there. And I, deep down, was still the same man who had loved this land with every fiber of his being. I returned to Chicago that night with clean pruning shears in my backpack and a heart lighter than it had been in decades. Jacob was waiting for me, worried. When he saw me, something in my face calmed him. In the following days, something extraordinary happened. My granddaughter Emma, Rose's daughter, came to visit me. She's 18 years old and at that age of searching for her identity. She asked me about my life, about the country, about why there was in my eyes that sadness that never completely left. I told her everything. I spoke to her about the wheat fields, about honest work, about love for the land. I showed her the contents of the trunk. I gave her my pruning shears to hold. And I saw something extraordinary in her eyes. Understanding. Connection with something she hadn't even known but recognized as part of her heritage. "Grandpa," she said, "I want to know that place. I want to see where you come from." And that's how, a week later, I made the return trip with my granddaughter. I showed her the ruins, the wheat I had tended, the plains that had watched generations of our family grow. I taught her how to use the pruning shears, to read the wheat, to respect the land. She absorbed it all with fascination. I don't know if she'll ever work the land as I did. Probably not. Her future is in the city, in jobs I can't even imagine. But now she carries with her the knowledge of her roots. Now she understands where she comes from. And that, I discovered, is enough to make it all worthwhile. When we returned to Chicago, Emma kept the pruning shears. "I'm going to keep them, Grandpa," she said. "And someday I'll give them to my children, so they know we come from people who worked the land with dignity and love." In that moment I understood the final lesson. We can't stop change. We can't make the world go back to what it was. But we can honor what we were while embracing what we are. We can be bridges between the past and the future. We can ensure that new generations know the stories, understand the sacrifices, value the heritage. Today I'm 74 years old. I live alone in a small apartment in Chicago. I miss the wheat fields every day of my life. But I no longer live with that desperate sadness that accompanied me for decades. Because now I know that the footprints I left on that land were less deep than the footprints that land left on me. And those interior footprints are eternal. No one can erase them. Not time, not progress, not distance. I am Samuel Hayes. I was a wheat farmer. I loved the land and was loved by it. And although the wheat fields no longer exist, although my body ages far from the plains I love, I remain in essence that 19-year-old boy who learned that honest work dignifies, that the land teaches us patience, and that some connections are so deep they transcend space and time. This is my story. The story of so many who had to choose between staying and starving, or leaving and dying of longing. I shared this story because I needed someone to know, for someone to remember, so the footprints of time wouldn't completely erase what we were. Thank you for listening. Thank you for allowing me to honor the memory of Mr. Patterson, of Martha, of all the men and women who worked the land with dignity. Their names will be forgotten. But their spirit, that spirit of honest work and love for what they did, that must survive. It must be passed on to new generations as the most valuable gift we can leave them. Because in the end, we are not what we possess nor the places where we live. We are the footprints we leave in the hearts of those who come after. And those footprints, those are eternal. Life teaches us that progress and tradition don't have to be enemies. We can honor our roots while embracing the future. We can remember with love what we were without being trapped in nostalgia. True wisdom is in being bridges, connecting the past with the present, tradition with innovation, what we were with what we are. Don't deny your history. Share it. Because in those stories lives the essence of who we are as a people, as family, as human beings seeking meaning in a world that changes faster than we can process.